Welcome. This presentation is to support y'all as you bring more assessments into the classroom and create more opportunities for assessment. So our guiding questions will be, what are assessments? How can I implement effective assessments in my classroom? What are some technology tools that I can use for assessment? And how can I use those technology tools? So, as we begin, what are assessments? We hear the word a lot, but simply put, assessment is, in part, the process of gathering evidence of student learning to inform instructional decisions. Chapuis and Siggins. Another way to look at it is that assessments are just how we collect data to measure student growth. Now, depending on the type of assessment, we use that data differently. But assessments, generally speaking, fall into two categories. There's formative assessments and summative assessments. I'm going to take a moment to go over the major differences between them. So in formative assessments, we give those during the learning process. We want to know what students know while we're teaching them. We want to measure what they know so far. And the reason we want to measure what they know so far is that so we can make adjustments to the instruction. I don't want to move on to another topic if students are still confused about the previous one. I want to know that. So it benefits me as the instructor. But also students benefit because it's an opportunity for students to take feedback and use it to change and adjust their work. So it can benefit students in that capacity. It can also be used to set goals as students move through a unit of learning. At the beginning, they may take a formative assessment, and then based on their strengths and weaknesses, they can set a goal of what they would like to get better at by the end of the unit. And the other thing about formative assessments is that they shouldn't be standalone. They're supposed to be used in combination with, interwoven even, into instruction. Now, a summative assessment is different in the sense that we give these at the end of a unit of study. They are used to measure a student's cumulative knowledge and skills. What can they do now that we have done all the learning? That doesn't mean that because we've done all the learning, or rather all the teaching, that they know everything. But the goal is that they did achieve their learning goals, and now this summative assessment will help us measure their success. While we may make, with a formative assessment, we may make adjustments to our lessons. A summative assessment isn't going to be used because it's done at the end of a unit of learning, we aren't going to use it to adjust lessons. Instead, we'd be using it to make general curriculum decisions, shifts that will affect the future. If, generally speaking, all students had a hard time with written responses, then moving forward, we're going to make sure that we create more space and opportunities for students to practice with that. It's also something that summative assessments are also things that we can use to rank our students. We use those rankings for grades. We use those rankings for intervention placements. There are all sorts of reasons you may want to know who is at the top of the class or who is not achieved mastery yet. In a summative assessment, feedback will be given, just like in a formative assessment. However, in a summative assessment, students aren't given the opportunity to make changes to their work. The feedback benefits the student because they know what they were successful with and what they weren't successful with. But as I note here, the scores are final. The summative assessments are not supposed to be opportunities for students to adjust their work. They're supposed to tell us where the students are by the end of a unit of learning. And what's interesting about formative assessments and summative assessments is, one might assume that because there are so many differences between them that they can't be the same task. But the reality is that a task can be given as a formative or a summative assessment. It really just depends on how you use the data and how students interact with the assessment. So I'm going to give some examples. So an example of a formative assessment could be an essay during a unit of study. Students give each other feedback using a rubric, and then they're allowed to adjust and resubmit their work. And this is formative because it's happening during the learning. It's formative because we are allowing students to adjust their work and resubmit it based on feedback. Another example would be a worksheet that is aligned with the learning objective. And the class goes over the correct answers as a whole, and then the teacher uses the data to inform the next day's lesson. Again, this is formative because it's an assessment that's taking place during the learning. Students are able to adjust their work, but more in this specific example, the greater purpose of this assessment is that a teacher could use the data to decide whether they're ready to move on the next day to the next lesson, or whether they need another day to review the material or to learn the material. Another example of a formative assessment could be in a French class. It's a discussion happening in French. The teacher uses a tracker and a student-facing rubric so that students know how they're being measured to collect data connected to the learning goal. Then the data is shared with the students and used to set a goal for the student. So a teacher might have an interview after the discussion, share how the student did during the discussion using that rubric, and then they could work together to set a goal so that throughout the course of learning, the student is striving to improve in a specific area. Again, this is happening during the learning. A student is adjusting their work and reflecting on their work. So for all those reasons, it is formative. Now over here, I've taken similar assessment tools and tasks, and I've shown how they could also exist as a summative assessment. If that essay was written at the end of the unit, the teacher would still give feedback and a score using a rubric, but that score now would be used as their grade. The feedback would be for their own benefit, but not to adjust their work, making it summative. It's at the end of the unit, and there aren't going to be adjustments made to the work. A selected response, a test, could be given at the end of a unit that addresses all the learning goals for the unit. The student's score is used for a grade and to make adjustments to the next year's scope and sequence. This becomes a summative assessment because, again, it's at the end of the unit of learning, and it talks about all of the learning goals, not just the learning goals from one lesson. And then the student's score isn't to help the student make adjustments, but it's instead used to rank the student, give them a grade, but also to make adjustments to the next year, not to the upcoming lesson. This is all making it summative. And finally, we go back to our French class, where at the end of the semester, the teacher interviews students in French and uses a rubric to measure student mastery of the learning goals from the whole semester. The grade and the feedback is shared with the student. The score is used as a grade. So similarly, there's an interview being held. Similarly, the student is speaking in French. Similarly, there's a rubric. However, because it's at the end of the semester, and because a goal isn't being set, instead a score is being given, this makes it summative. So now that we know about formative and summative assessments, the question becomes, how can I implement effective assessments in my classroom? Because there definitely is a difference between an effective and an ineffective assessment. So how can we make sure the assessments we're using in our classroom are effective? Well, I would say one of the most important, or at least the first thing you need to be thinking about, is the end. You want to start with the end in mind. What do I mean? What I mean is, in order to be effective, an assessment must be aligned to a clear, measurable learning goal. Why would we assess kids or students if we didn't know what we were assessing them on? The point of the assessment is to collect data and to measure, right? And so what are we measuring? Well, we're measuring their learning goal, like their mastery of the learning goal. So how do you start with the end in mind? This can be accomplished through backwards planning. And the way I would recommend is you start by choosing the standard you want your students to master. Then from that standard, you create learning goals based on the knowledge and skills that students will need. Then, breaking it down even further, you want to create assessments that accurately measure student knowledge and skills and aligns with the learning goals. And these assessments some of them will be formative and some of them will be summative, meaning that some of the assessments should measure the entirety of what students should know, and some of them will measure a piece of what the students should know. Then you can create exemplars and rubrics as needed. These are important to make sure students know what exemplar work would look like, and also the rubrics help students know how they're being assessed and what the teacher is thinking is critical to include and how to achieve that. And then the final step, although all these steps are broken down and can be broken down into even smaller steps, but the final major step is to design a lesson and activities that support the student acquisition of skills and knowledge. The lesson should serve the student's mastery of the standard. The assessment needs to measure it. I think too often we create lessons and then think, oh, okay, what test or assessment can I give to measure if the kids understood the lesson? But that doesn't support a learning goal. That just supports an activity. So it's important that we ground our assessments in a clear, measurable learning goal. And the way we do that is to start with the end in mind. Now, I slipped up and used the word test, but assessments should not just be tests. It is important that we choose an assessment that is a good fit for what we want to measure. Different methods work well or not so well with different types of achievement targets. So, if they're not just tests, what else could they be? There are generally 4 different assessment methods. There's selected response, which could be a multiple choice, a true-false items. It can also be fill in the blank. There can be written responses, such as short answer, extended response, or essay. There could be a performance assessment. That could be a student performance, whether it be in physical education or in theater or even debate. Or there could be a product, such as in art class. And then our final category or type of assessment method is personal communication, like in that French class. Interviews, conferences, journals, oral exams, even questioning students during class. These are all different types of assessments. We should not be limiting ourselves to pencil and paper tests. So if we're going to determine, if we have all these assessments to choose from, then how do we choose the right one? Well, you have to then think about your learning goals, which is why we start with our standards and our learning goals. Because a different achievement target, different learning goals reflect different achievement targets, and different achievement targets are better measured by different assessment methods. Let me break this down and make this clearer. So, my learning goal may be asking students to gain knowledge. And if they're gaining knowledge, such as facts that they need to have memorized, information that they need to know, then while a selected response, multiple choice test might be a good way to assess them, a written response or even questioning students or having them, discuss their ideas would be an even stronger way to determine a student's knowledge. On the other hand, if we are asking students if the learning goal is asking students to be able to demonstrate their reasoning, and they need to be able to reason and logic things out and figure things out, then we need to make a choice for an assessment that will match that. A written response is a great way for a student to demonstrate that. Personal communication, great way. Selected response and performance, they're okay. If we look at that performance skill, if a student is in physical education and a gym teacher needs to know, PE teacher needs to know that a student knows how to correctly swing a bat, then a selected response is not going to be a great way to measure that. However, performance assessment, where the gym teacher asks a student to come up and demonstrate how to swing a baseball bat, that's going to be a much better way. So I have some examples that could help you when you're making decisions. So what could that look like? That could look like assessing a student's knowledge of the periodic table of elements in chemistry with a fill in the blank, which is a selected response test, or an oral exam, personal communication. But a performance is not going to be the best way and most effective way to assess that. Another example, that could also look like a teacher assessing a student's reasoning as they make inferences in a text with a written response or an interview, which would be personal communication, rather than a selected response or performance assessment. So now that you know that there's all these different ways we can assess students, it's important that we don't rely on just one type of assessment. Specifically, I'm referring to formative versus summative assessments. It is incredibly important that we use a balance of both formative and summative assessments to support our student growth. Throughout a unit of study, teachers should use both formative and summative assessments. The summative assessments are good because they allow for data collection that schools and districts can use to evaluate educational programs or for teachers to determine a student's mastery of a learning standard. However, a teacher needs to include formative assessments because they're necessary to create opportunities for students to reflect and improve, and for the teacher to analyze and adjust. An assessment can't be effective unless both are used. Another important element of effective assessments is student involvement. Students should get involved. Assessments should not just be a one-way street. Teachers should create opportunities for student involvement. Student involvement builds engagement, it deepens student understanding, it encourages critical thinking, and it creates an opportunity for student ownership over their own learning. So here are some examples of what it could look like if students got involved in assessments. It could look like peer feedback. Students take a rubric that teachers created, and then they use it to evaluate each other's work and give each other feedback. That's putting them in the position of analyzing someone else's work, but someone else's work that is on the same topic as theirs. So instead of just staring at their own work and trying to figure out what they could do better, they are now given the opportunity to look at another student's work and see a different way of doing it, of accomplishing the same task. And that helps them look at the content from a different perspective. But additionally, it helps them to analyze the rubric in a different way. No longer are they looking at it where from the perspective of, did I do a good job? But instead, could this also be a good job? But what makes a good job? I look at the rubric. I'm now interacting with the rubric in a way that is more in depth than perhaps a student would have looked at it for their own work. So it just gets their brains thinking about the task in a different way, and it deepens that understanding. And it builds engagement. Students enjoy it in a new way. Students can also benefit from self-feedback. So asking students to grade their own work and evaluate their own work can be very powerful and empowering. They are no longer just passengers waiting for the teacher to tell them when they've succeeded or when they haven't. Instead, they are owning their own work and saying, I successfully used evidence to support my reasons. However, I'm noticing my explanation, I only have an explanation in one of my body paragraphs, not in all three. So they are owning their work and they are seeing opportunities for improvement, which will truly benefit them in the sense that it will help them with this task, but it will also help them learn the skill of analyzing and revising their work. So they are learning while assessing. And then as far as another way you can get students involved is student created assessments. Students can get involved and help to create the assessment itself. Again, this is another opportunity. All three of these are really create the same opportunity for students to get into the driver's seat, to see the content and the information from a different perspective. It's important that students are not only able to answer questions, but also to ask them. And if we want students to learn how to ask relevant and purposeful questions, then helping them create the assessment is a great way to do that. Additionally, it helps them deepen their understanding, because if you don't truly understand content, you can't ask a question and know what the answer should be. So in order to create an assessment, students need to be able to both ask the question, but also understand how someone could answer it. So it's just a new and engaging way for students to interact with the content and shift their perspective. It can be very empowering and very engaging. You've heard me now refer to feedback several times. And feedback is, I think, one of the most important parts of assessing. And it can't just be feedback. It has to be good feedback. An assessment is a method to collect data, but as you've seen, it is also an opportunity for student growth. In order to improve student work, students need to know how. And in order to ensure they understand the content in a more general way, they need to know why they had to make adjustments. One of the best ways to do this is through feedback. And feedback is not just good job or I really liked it. Feedback has to there's criteria for good feedback. Feedback needs to be relevant. By this, I mean it needs to be connected to the assessed learning goals. It needs to be actionable. Students need to be able to use it to make adjustments. It needs to be specific and concrete. Students can understand what needs to be adjusted or kept and why. And then it also needs to be timely. Students need to receive this feedback in a time frame that allows them to make adjustments or at least apply it to their next similar effort. If we wait until the end of a semester to give students feedback, then it's of very little benefit to them. So I've created an example so that you can see what good feedback could look like in action. So my example includes a learning goal of students will be able to retell in writing the events of a story, including characters, key details, and plot points. So good feedback could look like this. You included important plot points from the story, and that helped me know what happened in the story. Your inclusion of the setting was a detail that helped me visualize the story. If you had included the name of the central characters, I would have had an easier time understanding what happened in the story. So let's break this down and understand what is good about, or what is effective about this feedback. So I've gone ahead and highlighted in orange the relevant parts of my feedback. So in the learning goal, it says students need to include characters, key details, and plot points. So then we look to my feedback where I mentioned that they included the plot points from the story, the setting as a detail, and I talked about the fact that they didn't name essential characters. So all of this is connected to the assessed learning goal. Now in green here, I highlighted the actionable part, the part that the student can use to make adjustments. I mentioned that if you had included the name of the central characters, meaning that they can look at this and say, great, I know what to do next. I need to include the names of the central characters. It's very actionable. Here in blue, I've highlighted the parts that are specific and concrete, which means that the student can understand what needs to be adjusted or kept and why. So they know that they need to keep the parts that helped me. So I said it helped me. This is the why. It helped me know what happened in the story. The why helped me visualize a story. That's why they need to keep these things. And then over here, I mentioned that if you had included the name of the central characters, I would have had an easier time understanding what happened in the story. So there we go. That's what needs to be changed, and that's why you need to change it. Now, in the example I gave you, you can't see the timely element. However, if I had given this feedback to a student in the moment or shortly thereafter, they could have made adjustments and resubmitted it. And that would have made it timely. So effective, now you know some elements of effective assessments. We can always use the low-tech methods of assessing that are familiar, such as pencils and writing journals, or paper tests or classroom discussions. These are fine and good. However, there are some great technology tools that can help when it comes to assessment. And some of those benefits are they can support student needs with universal design elements. They can collect data for us, and they keep students engaged. So I'm going to show you a couple of those so that if you wanted to try them on your own, you could. So the technology tools I'm going to talk about today are Google Docs, Google Forms, Nearpod, and Edpuzzle. So Google Docs and Forms are part of the Google Suite, which is in general a convenient resource with several technology tools such as Google Classroom, Google Spreadsheets, but Google Docs and Google Forms I have found especially helpful. So Google Docs are super helpful, I find, for formative assessments. You can use them, of course, for summative assessments. There's nothing that prohibits you from doing that. But I think some of the benefits come when I use it as a formative assessment. So when I assign it through Google Classroom in the Google Suite, or even having a student share their doc with me as their teacher, you can leave feedback directly onto their student work. So here we can see I highlighted that Tom rides his bike to Ed's house, and this writing right here is in yellow. I highlighted it, and I put the note that the details you included helped me visualize what was happening. So the student now knows that they should keep this because it helps with the visualizing of what's going on. Down here, I mentioned that when the student wrote suddenly, the lights went off, and that the kids were screaming, it added a lot of suspense to the story. So again, another reason to keep this, that feedback is very concrete. And then down here, I was able to highlight that if they had included more details, it would have helped to build the suspense and help me visualize what was happening in this moment. So it just helps me as a teacher give more specific and concrete feedback, because I can really pinpoint where in the story or in the writing my feedback applies. But it also helps me keep feedback timely because I don't have to wait for a student to submit this. I can look in on a student's work as they are writing, and I can give them feedback so that it can be um, I don't have to wait until they finish and then they have to go all the way back. I can help them along their way with feedback. And I can see the changes. You can always view the history. And so if I want to reflect and record data, I can look back at the history of changes and see what the student was struggling with or what they were succeeding with. The other nice thing is that in the same way that they can share the document with me, they can also share it with their peers and give each other feedback during the writing process. So Google Docs is very helpful in that sense. Now, Google Forms are also great. You can use them for summative or formative assessments. It allows for multiple forms of questions: short answer, multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, or extended response. And then I mentioned earlier about that UDL, that Universal Design, which can be so helpful for our students on IEPs, for our English language learners, but then again, just also for students who learn differently than others, and are differently abled students. So questions can be accompanied by visuals or even videos. So that means that if I have an English language learner who would benefit from visuals, then I can put them in with the question. If I have a student whose accommodations say that they get read aloud, I can record videos or I can record audio of myself reading the questions, and they can listen to the questions instead of having me sit beside them and read them. So it's beneficial and more engaging in that it's more engaging in that capacity, but it's also beneficial as a teacher and as a student. It creates a independence for our students, and it creates more time for the teachers. Now, after students have submitted their work, teachers can look at the data for the entire class by question or each student's individual responses. And teachers can leave feedback to groups of students based on their responses or by individual responses. So up here you see I've circled where it says add feedback. This is me looking at the entire class's responses. And so I see for this question, this multiple choice question, 29 students got the right answer and 6 students did not. Now for those 6 students, because it's just a multiple choice question, I don't feel that I need to leave personalized, individualized feedback, but instead I can do a group. I can create feedback that would work for all 6 of those students. And so it saves myself time as a teacher. But additionally, while it's nice to save myself time, the benefit of that is that I don't miss out on opportunities to give students feedback because I don't have enough time to do it. So it's not just the luxury of time, but it's also the efficiency that allows me to get more done and respond to more students. Over here you can see this is me looking at a single student's responses to a question later on in the Google form. And the student wrote a response that only got them half credit, so I took this opportunity to write feedback that highlighted what was correct about what she had written, but also what a complete answer would have included. So she now will be able to look at that, and while she won't be able to adjust her assessment because I use this as a summative, it is something where I can make sure that she understands what she could have, like what the correct answer was and what a complete answer would have looked like. Depending on how you like to collect data and how you like to interact with it, another feature that can be very helpful is that Google Forms can transfer all the data into spreadsheets. And that can be helpful because sometimes we don't want to have to go back to the Google form to see what kids answered, what a student answered. Sometimes we want to have it out in front of us all in one place. And that really can be very helpful. It's a helpful feature. The other thing is, depending on what types of questions and how you want to use your data, from Google Sheets, you can then have that information translated into a graph, a graph that can help with data analysis. So especially for our summative assessments where we want to rank students, or where we want to see in general which standards were mastered or students struggled with overall, a feature like that can be very helpful. So I do like using Google Forms for that. The next technology tool I'm going to talk about is Nearpod. So Nearpod is an online platform, which means that you would go to the website to use it. Although my school has it as part of their Clever Suite. It's an online platform that allows teachers to create interactive slides that can both teach but also assess students. So typically I've used it as formative assessments because of that feature. However, you can set it up as a summative that is just assessing with no teaching element to it. So teachers can use previously created Nearpod slides, or they can make their own slides, and they engage students and they can introduce them to new materials, and it allows students to demonstrate their understanding in lots of different ways. So I've given some screenshot examples down here. You can see here with the Apollo missions that teachers can use embedded articles and videos. And in the video, you can see on the timeline down here, there are dots. That's because the teacher has inserted pause points with questions in the video. And you can see that you can choose to turn on or off interaction mode. So you could choose to have your students just watch the video, or you can choose to have it that it pauses for them and ask them a question, assessing their understanding as they interact with the video. Now over on the right-hand side, I've included some images of the different ways in this lesson that a student might be assessed. There's multiple choice questions. There's a collaborative discussion board where students can post responses to a question or a prompt, and the whole class can see it. It's sort of like that's why they make it like a cork board, a bulletin board. And this also encourages student discussion and can be an opportunity for peer feedback because students can leave comments on each other's notes. Also, thinking about that UDL element, not all of our students are reading and writing. Some of our students would prefer or might do a better job drawing out their responses. So this is another way you can have students respond. And I found this especially helpful with my younger students, my first graders, because it was a great way for me to see what they understood and not having, because as I was teaching them science, I wasn't measuring their reading fluency or their ability for text comprehension. What I wanted to know was I wanted to know whether they understood the scientific concepts and could apply it. So the drawing feature on Nearpod was very helpful for that. And of course there is, I don't know if you can see, but down here there's also the text tool. So if a student wanted to type their response in here, they could. There are multiple ways that students could respond to a prompt in this slide. And then over here we see written response, and students can write a response, but the nice feature is that students can also click on an embedded video or articles so they can reference back and look for evidence in a text or refer back to it. And all of these responses, no matter what form they take, would be shared with the teacher. So teachers can choose to have students use Nearpod as a class with live participation, which means that the teacher controls the pacing, but students follow along and interact on their own devices, but they aren't controlling the pacing. Or they can use it as student paced, which allows students to control the speed at which they move through the slides. And this is really good for asynchronous work. So when I was teaching remotely, we had synchronous days and asynchronous days. And I would use live participation when we were all together in the Zoom. And I would use student paced when it was an asynchronous day. And regardless of which method you use, all the student responses are shared with the teacher, allowing the teacher to collect data and view student responses. So below here, I've taken a screenshot, and on the side here would have been the students' names, but I've cut them out, obviously, for privacy. And each row is a student, and so you can see how much of the Nearpod they participated in. And you can also see their scores and level of participation. And you can see here it says open-ended question. You can click on this report and you will be able to see all the student responses. Or you can go to the student and you can see everything that they did. So similarly to how on Google Forms you could see either the class responses by item, or you can see an individual's responses for the entire assessment. You can do so similarly in Nearpod. So students do receive feedback when they answer selected response questions because they can see whether they got it right or wrong. But the program doesn't currently allow feedback for written responses to be given to the students through the program. So on the occasions that I have wanted to give students additional feedback on their written responses, I've just simply printed out the report page and written my feedback on that response page, or had a conference with the student to give them their feedback. So it's still very simple, but it's not something that a student would go back into Nearpod and check for their feedback. Now the final technology tool that I was going to talk about is Edpuzzle. And Edpuzzle has some overlaps with Nearpod in that it's an online platform. And again, there's an interactive element, which is very engaging for our students and supportive of students who have different needs. Unlike Nearpod, which is slides-based, Edpuzzle is video-based. So teachers can use existing web videos from websites such as YouTube, or they can even record their own videos and upload those. But then they can use Edpuzzle to edit the video. So they can crop it, they can splice it, they can trim it, they can keep certain elements that they want or get rid of parts that they don't need students to interact with. And then they insert pause points with questions. So teachers can take advantage of pre-made Edpuzzles that teachers share with each other, or they can create their own. It allows for formative assessments through questioning, similar to like how we might do in a traditional lesson. A teacher would stand in front of the class, deliver content information, but a teacher is going to stop and ask some questions during the class to make sure the students are with them and understanding. And in a similar way, the Edpuzzle allows you to do that for videos. Questions can be in the form of selected response or written responses. And one benefit is that unlike a traditional lesson, like I just described, students can rewatch the video sections as many times as they need to in order to answer the question. So if you assign this as an independent asynchronous activity, students can just take their time and they can rewatch. And that's great for our students who take more time to process or because of language acquisition, or because of learning disabilities, or because they are differently abled. So there are lots of reasons a student might need to rewatch, and this gives them the opportunity to, unlike in a classroom setting where there's just one time that you hear something and a student might, if they miss it, they no longer know that. So Edpuzzle creates that engagement because it's both interactive and through that use of videos. You can slow it down, you can speed it up, you can watch it again. It's a more engaging experience. Teachers can also choose to use Edpuzzle in live mode, similar to Nearpod, and they can project it to the whole class while the students answer on their own computers, or students can use it independently, moving at their own pace. Either way, teachers receive the data from student responses, and teachers are, unlike Nearpod, able to leave feedback for students, which is great because it allows a student to improve or understand mistakes that they have made. And as we discussed earlier, effective and good feedback is one of the most important elements in effective assessment. So if you don't want to have your students on their computers, another way that I have used Edpuzzle is to project a preview from my computer and use it as a class. So we answer the questions together on my screen, which is sort of like a mixture of the more traditional teaching lesson and it's a bit of a hybrid between a traditional lesson and a technology-based lesson. It does make it more engaging, and it also creates a great opportunity to review as a class if the students had already used Edpuzzle for independent work previously. So, for example, if when giving feedback, I noticed that there was one part of the Edpuzzle, of the lesson, of the assessment that students really struggled with, I could choose to play that for the class, just that section with that question, and we could work as a class to clarify misconceptions and give students another at-bat. So I found it a really helpful tool. So I hope this has been helpful. I highly recommend the book, An Introduction to Student-Involved Assessment for Learning. It's really a great way to learn more about effective assessment. Additionally, I have linked here the technology tools that I have talked about with Google Forms, Google Docs, Nearpod, and Edpuzzle. And I hope this has been helpful as you try to incorporate more effective assessments into your teaching practice.